Well, thank you so much for doing this.
No problem.
I feel like you're a legendary Connecticut person.
A legendary Connecticut person?
Yes.
Okay.
But I think like in a great way too. It can provide like a lot of thoughts on like growing up here and seeing the music scene from here over the decades.
Sure.
And so you grew up in Wolcott, Connecticut.
Yeah, I went to high school there.
Are you more of a Lake Compounce or a Quasi guy?
Probably more of a Lake Compounce guy.
Why?
God, I mean, don't they have the oldest coaster in America there?
They do.
I mean, it's a sick coaster. It's a gnarly ride, and so it's got a classic wooden sort of
Do you enjoy riding on it? Because it's really bumpy.
Yeah, that's the appeal of a wooden coaster. I feel like obviously with a wooden coaster in general, you don't get like the flips and the loop-de-loops and so on and so forth. You just get the sensation that this could fall apart at any moment.
And you like that.
That's the thrill. Yeah.
Well, that's really good to know. Thank you for sharing that.
No problem.
I know like I've obviously like sort of seen about how your music interests have evolved over time and growing up, and it seemed like in high school was when you started really getting into like the music scene, quote unquote, and like finding your interests. What was that early music scene like for you, and were you going to like shows in the area?
There was a kind of semi-healthy network of loosely connected VFW shows going on around the time, like obviously like in the area the what was once kind of like the Wallingford VFW is kind of like stuff of legend, but like there were actually a lot of Waterbury VFW shows, bands that kind of sounded like new metal groups and metalcore groups and maybe a few Tool knockoffs here and there, the like edgy shit like that. But like, yeah, that was kind of like what the local band scene was like. You pay a few dollars at the door and you go upstairs and you could mosh for a couple hours to, like a handful of bands, and it was good. It was a cool place to kind of like explore music beyond just like what you might be hearing on like a festival stage or on Radio 104, like WCCC at the time, which was like, kind of like the big local metal station.
Were you comfortable in that scene? Like, did you like moshing? And
yeah, at the time, yeah. Being a bigger kid, like you feel pretty good moshing. It's one of the few places in society where you can, in a healthy way, just sort of like exert your size over everyone else without any sort of like, repercussions.
Mm-hmm. And were you playing at those shows or?
No, just kind of going to the shows. Yeah. Just watching other bands perform. I had a few friends in high school that like played in some of those bands, but I wasn't playing in them myself.
How would you describe like the Connecticut music sound?
I don't know if I would say there's a quintessential sound, broadly speaking. I would say around that time, it seemed like most of the newer and local bands that I was hearing were kind of like almost like a bit of a trickle down thing, again, from the fact that like one of the biggest sort of like local radio stations in the area played predominantly like metal and new metal. Add on to that, you also had like Hatebreed doing really well in the scene, and that's obviously going to influence a lot of groups locally. And then also like once I was getting toward the tail end of high school and transitioning into college, that's also when the ska scene was really starting to take off, and ctska.com was like posting a lot of shows, and I was going to a lot of those concerts too. And there were some local bands, but also there just kind of seemed to be a hunger, a market for it among the local scene. So there were a lot of groups from out of state traveling in to perform and doing really well at like local shows. So I would say that was like kind of predominantly what youth culture at the time was at least into. There's always been like a singer-songwriter scene in CT and that sort of thing, but like that's not predominantly where I was hanging out.
I feel like a punk scene of Connecticut seems to be like very much a through line from like the early 2000s to now too, like kind of like still alive. And how do you feel like the venue sort of, not scene, but sort of like ecosystem changed from then into now?
There's less places, like either we've lost VFWs or there are less VFWs willing to sort of like give their time to these kids to sort of like allow them to rent them and do shows there. And there also sort of seems to be like a waning interest in kids kind of like doing that as a means of kind of building some sort of like local music scene or community. Sometimes when I mention these days online in passing, like in a video commentary or something like that, talking about local music scenes, like often I will get responses with people just being like, what's a VFW? I have no idea. Something about this way of doing things, I think, has been like sort of, not necessarily communicated or translated in the way that it should be from one generation to the next. And it's kind of like led to a lot of Gen Zers having no clue about any of this history and having no idea as to how to start, going about recreating it for themselves.
Yeah.
And also when I was younger, there were just like any number of like cool dives that you could randomly see a show at, where maybe you like saw the flyer, the poster like posted in passing on like MySpace or something like that. There was like a really gnarly one that was like on this main road in Southington, going between like Southington and Plainville. I think there was like a strip club, along the same road, but like they ended up closing it. And it was real nasty when you went in there. I had like a bunch of like broken old arcade cabinets and stuff.
Wow.
It was like not a well kept place, but again, you could like go there and see like some really cool bands. And the few times that I did go, there were like at least a couple hundred kids, and some of these bands weren't really doing much more other than like doing G.G. Allen covers, like, and people were just sort of showing up to go crazy at these things. It was a cool time, and it was a nice sort of like, moment and scene to be intertwined in kind of like loosely in the way that I was. But like, it's lost a lot of like, I think, stages and platforms and areas to kind of like exist. And those places are fewer and far between now, or at least like, maybe it's more difficult to kind of like just be having those places just kind of hanging around, because obviously like cost of living is higher, rent is higher, everything's more expensive now.
Did you have a favorite place that you went to when you lived in New Haven, like when you went to Southern?
I mean, I went to the Space a lot, and eventually like the Spaceland Ballroom when, that was like starting to come up. Immediately in that area, I was like mostly going to like the space shows and that sort of thing. Sometimes open mics down there too. I mean, I've gone to some Webster and Webster Underground shows as well that were pretty cool, but obviously like I've never lived immediately outside of Hartford, so that was like always maybe a little bit more of a trek, but still, it was always worth it whenever I went out.
I'm curious your thoughts on this. Like, do you feel like Manic Presents has like a monopoly on the venues in Connecticut?
I mean, that's kind of like another element of it, because during those college years, that's when we slowly started seeing like interest in the broader indie scene start to like really creep in. And that didn't have as much of, I think, a demand like in the late 90s, early 2000s. It wasn't really until like, Pitchfork Supremacy and the blogosphere kind of popping off. And, that was also around the time that I was starting to do what I did. With the Needle Drop as a podcast and a blog. Mark was also kind of like on the come up, booking all the shows that he was, and I agree with like that framing. There is like a little bit of a monopoly between what he's doing, especially like being tied in with College Street and being tied in with Spaceland Ballroom and so on and so forth. But like I was around pretty much every step of the way for years, that he was like starting this from the ground up, and Asbestos Records and the Forum and the sort of like the way the scene was kind of like built off of that back in the day. And there just wasn't anybody else providing the level of competition that he was, so it's like, while he is definitely like sucking up a lot of opportunities, it has like, in his defense, like come as a result of years of doing it in a way that just like nobody else was either doing it because he was doing it better, or was just willing to, because it's not like anybody was pulling off the moves that he was before, prior to him. Like he got the pains of being pure at heart to come play in Wallingford at a completely sold out show before they got like best new music on Pitchfork, and there were so many people there that like they couldn't fit everyone in the venue. It was like crazy. And those are the kind of shows that he was actually able to pull off in that VFW. It's like he got some crazy names to go through that place. And, for, again, it just being like a room where you're supposed to be just fitting a couple hundred people. And, a lot of shows that he was doing were packing a lot more than that in that room.
What's kind of kept you in Connecticut?
I just kind of like the ability to unplug from what I have to do. I feel like if I was constantly being pounded by being sort of like next to a major hub like in LA or like in New York, it would drive me crazy, or I feel like I would get a little more sucked up into it than I would like to be. I mean, I feel like for what I do, the proximity and the closeness that I have to it is appropriate and makes sense. I feel like in order to be an effective critic, at least in the way that I want to be, like I do need to sort of like hold a little bit of distance and independence from sort of the traditional music industry as we know it. And I sort of saw the internet as an opportunity to sort of like, you know, just forge a different path into doing it when I first started. And you know, I'm glad I made the right call. Very early on, there were like a few opportunities to like sell the website and sell the brand and sort of do what I do for somebody else, you know, for like a bigger company and a bigger sort of like outlet. But I just kind of turned it down because I just thought that remaining independent would like make more sense. And, you know, as good as that has been, there's definitely been downsides. You know, there have been like opportunities that have come up that I would have been able to take if I was in closer proximity to the music industry, or like because I'm doing most things independently, like sometimes when a big, you know, project or idea comes up, I'm like, you know, shelling out the dough for it because I'm doing it on my own. But at least at the end of the day, at least for me, I kind of like value more the peace of mind that knowing that I own it and control it and don't have to kind of like worry about whether or not it sort of like passes muster for an editor or an advertiser. And I just have to worry about whether or not it works for me and works for my audience and just kind of go from there.
Do you enjoy what you do?
Yeah, no, for sure. Like, you know, there are aspects of it that I don't, but all of that has mostly to do with just kind of like the general stresses of the internet and just people coming at you aggressively or weirdly over just like music opinions and stuff like that. And that's not like the fault of the music itself, you know?
What do you think the fault of that is?
It's just the way the internet works, you know? I mean, obviously people are entitled to have their own opinion, but really what it is like social media platforms especially are just like skewed in all ways toward negativity. So, you know, anything negative that somebody's saying about me gets heightened over anything positive. And also, like, you know, outside of my own control, anything negative I'm saying about a particular artist or record gets heightened over more positive reviews that I'm giving. And the vast majority of reviews that I'm giving, you know, may be critical, but are at least like see a more positive side of, you know, the records that I'm reviewing. And, you know, it's not to sort of like paint a one-sided picture, because some of my most popular reviews are definitely positive ones. My most popular review is a positive review.
Which one is your most popular?
It's To Pimp a Butterfly.
Okay.
From Kendrick, which I gave a 10 out of 10. But like, you know, it does sort of seem like the reviews that consistently like get the most discourse and get the most conversations going are the ones where I'm like really tearing apart the album and, you know, ripping it a new asshole. Which I think if you're going to be a critic that people put any kind of faith in, has to be like it's a necessary evil, you know. Not that you need to go out of your way to like, you know, find something to hate, but like you're not going to like everything, you know. If you're doing as much as you can to sort of like cover as much as you can and be sort of like having your finger on the pulse of anything that's worth discussing and worth talking about in the broader world of music, like you're not going to enjoy it all, you know. And it's just a matter of like backing up your feelings and giving reasoning for why that you feel the way that you do.
Yeah,
that's definitely something I've had to kind of think about broadly in recent years, because, you know, I do tend to sort of like listen to you know, just like a personal casual level, like more music that's underground, more music that's just like more obscure. And sometimes there are artists I might find a little bit interesting, but maybe a project they've come through with isn't that great or doesn't impress me all the way through. And I know for a fact there are some people that maybe take my points or my views or my opinions maybe a little bit too much as gospel, and maybe will count a certain artist out or sort of think less of them down the road if I happen to be really underwhelmed by a certain project they've put out. And I feel like that can be kind of a devastating thing if you're an artist who's like just starting and hasn't even like built up an audience of their own yet, outside of the number of people that are going to see me talking about the record, you know what I mean? So sometimes it's important to kind of be a little picky and choosy about like what I'm covering, especially if I am going to be negative about it, and make sure that like, you know, ultimately the words that I'm saying are going to have some kind of like negative impact that's going to be outside of the artist's control, because, you know, I don't do what I do for the purpose or for the intention of being like, yeah, you know, all the music that I don't like, I could totally end this artist's career. You know, it's like, that's not a thing that's not a weight I want to have on my shoulders. That's not something I think is my responsibility or my duty to do, you know? It's like more my duty to analyze things and give viewers pause and make them think about why it is they like what they like or why they dislike what they dislike. You know, it's not to have sort of a negative impact on an artist's well-being long term.
Do you think that's like what the worthwhile part of music criticism is to like help someone understand the music more? Or, like, why do you think it's worthwhile to share your opinion, I guess?
Especially in an age where like, and I know I'm not perfect on this front, but in an age where like media literacy is at an all-time low, and I feel like most of the throughways that people get music by these days, like Spotify and so on and so forth, it very much encourages passive listening, like as much passive listening as possible. You know, it doesn't really encourage you to engage with the stuff that you're hearing, especially through playlists and an emphasis on sort of like, you know, music curation that emphasizes chillness and wallpaper and anything that can sort of be like, you know, just played passively or played in the background while you're doing something else. Like, it's not very engaging, you know, the sort of experience a lot of these platforms are trying to sort of like give their users when it comes to sort of like thinking about the music that you're hearing and why it is or isn't appealing. Or digging beyond something that is supposed to actually engage you beyond like, oh, this just like kind of sounds nice in the background. So anything that can sort of like, you know, shake people out of that mindset and get them to actually sort of like consider what makes the music that they like so much work or appeal to them, I think is like a positive thing. That, and I think, you know, just the opportunity to kind of like shine a light on records or songs or artists that I think are good and not getting the kind of like, you know, promotion or positive reception that they're deserving of, but maybe they don't get it because they don't have the same kind of like commercial appeal of as a Bruno Mars or something like that.
I watched the not horrifying, but very stressful to watch Adam Friedland interview that you did. And a lot of that interview was him being like, what gives you the right?
Right.
And so I'm kind of curious, like, I agree with that, all of that with music criticism, but like, sort of like, what do you feel like that you bring to the table of like music criticism?
It's kind of hard to say like now, because I feel like the landscape in which I started is like gone. You know, I at least like have a conception of like what it was when I began. I really kind of started not even as a music reviewer initially. Like my original intention was to just kind of be like, I'm going to run this podcast and I'm going to run this blog and I'm only doing positive reviews and I'm only covering stuff that I feel like other people aren't talking about enough. And that was cool. And I enjoyed doing that. And I enjoy doing that now. And I do feel like that's something I still try to hold to and still try to like emphasize in my work, making sure that every week I'm like trying to cover or talk about or engage with something that I think is going a little overlooked, or, you know, giving thoughts or perspectives on records that I don't see a whole lot of people voicing. But the further I went along and, you know, with building an audience with what I do, especially on YouTube, the more kind of comments and feedback that I was getting that were just like kind of telling me, hey, what do you think of the new Strokes album or something, you know, or what do you think of the new Kanye album? Which, I mean, is obviously flattering because, I mean, that tells you that these people value your opinion enough on these smaller records that they want to know what you think about these bigger records too. But I mean, that wasn't necessarily, you know, my original intention going into it. It has shifted in a lot of ways. And even incorporating more sort of like popular artists and records ultimately in the long run has not been a bad thing, because that's obviously just built my audience larger and provided me more opportunities to then push the way of those same viewers, like, oh, well, now here's a more obscure record that I think is worth your time, you know?
Right.
And that couldn't have happened if I just sort of only ended up talking about albums that virtually had no SEO value because nobody's looking for them, because people haven't heard of them yet. Like, I was one of the first people to review and talk about and sing the praises of like Rosalia, you know, before she like popped off. And I was on that last Geese record before everybody was talking about them in this new album cycle. And, you know, I put hundreds of thousands of people onto those artists before, you know, they were sort of like the media darlings that they are now, and arguably had, you know, an influence in sort of like creating that dichotomy. To me, that's like that, and helping to inform people's perspectives on how to sort of like listen and analyze and sort of like pick apart and dissect music. I mean, that's really where I think the most value out of what I do comes from.
What do you look for when you're listening to music? I'm sure like every single person who's ever interviewed you brings up an album that they disagree with your opinion on, because it's like you've reviewed so many different albums. Mine's MJ Lenderman. I feel like I was like, I get what you're saying with how it's like a Pavement like knockoff, or that it's like he sounds like a sad old man, but like I think it's like that those aren't bad qualities in my opinion.
It's funny, like that is definitely one of the reviews that I consistently get the most shit on, but truth be told, there have been some, and you know, it's like this is obviously something I can't speak too much to because I don't want to like throw anybody under the bus, but there have been like some artists who have reached out to me about that review and been like, yeah man, I'm glad you said that shit.
About MJ Lenderman?
Yeah, you know, it's unfortunate, you know, it's like just, you know, see, it's so funny because like, and there are a lot of artists who watch what I do, but they would never let you know for a handful of reasons, because obviously like, you know, showing too much of an interest sort of like brings a certain validity to me among their audience. And what if I end up not liking their next record? You know what I mean? Like you don't want to end up having that kind of like bite you in the butt. You know, you wouldn't know it because rarely do artists like post about this sort of stuff on social media, but artists have some of the strongest opinions on music that you could ever imagine. You know, and whenever I get the chance to maybe talk to some of them backstage or whatever, it usually like very quickly kind of moves into a like, oh, this record's shit, this record's whatever kind of opinion, like, oh, you know, I agree with you on that, or what the hell were you thinking about this, or, you know, I can't believe you liked that because this is terrible. But the thing is, like, this is the sort of thing they could never really put out there into the world, because the minute that they sort of voice these opinions on social media, it's like a complete firestorm, and before you know it, like one fan base is pulling another fan base apart, and you know, sort of like, and you know, you have all these people that maybe potentially had a lot of crossover audience, and they're just not going to listen to you anymore over, you know, the fact that you have a preference here or there. So I mean, you know, it's just something funny. I still have those feelings on that record, unfortunately, but I do like his guitar playing, and I do like his contributions in Wednesday. Wednesday is like, you know, very much like grown on me in the past year. I think the new record is pretty good, has some excellent tracks on it.
You liked it more than the most recent MJ Lenderman album?
Oh yeah. No, for sure.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I sort of was wondering, like, what do you value when you're listening to music?
Obviously, at the end of the day, no matter what I say, no matter how I answer this question, it's all personal preference, you know? But like the longer I go, the more difficult it is to sort of like put a broad criteria on it, and the more that sort of it feels like I'm, you know, looking at things and listening to things in certain contexts, and it's all like context dependent. It's dependent upon how these songs and how this record fits maybe in this artist's discography, how it all fits and sort of like how it all sounds within the greater lane or style or genre or scene that they're operating within. Because like, by what standards does music sound good within, you know, those confines? It's also lately got me thinking more about like how certain records and how certain sort of like album cycles or trends sound within certain spans of time and years. Like, for example, would hyperpop had hit as hard culturally as it did if not for the fact that it kind of like popped up in the way or the fashion that it did during the pandemic? You know, could Brat have happened in any other year than when it did? Would it have made sense if it came like 3 years later or 3 years before? There is a lot of that comes into play as well in terms of like what I think the criteria of what like really appeals to me specifically is. And I'll say, like, you know, with that album particularly, you know, looking in the, I guess like the greater singer-songwriter canon and what a lot of singer-songwriters are doing now, I just don't find him to be a very interesting lyricist. And across the record, I just don't think the playing and interplay between the drums, bass, and guitar like really stands out to me all that much.
What do you say the lyrics though? Because they're such weird lyrics. Why don't you find them interesting?
They're weird, but like it just doesn't come across to me as like weird enough, or at least like the way in which they're weird just feels very
the Himbo Dome isn't enough for you.
The Himbo Dome did not do it for me. The Himbo Dome did not do it for me. Neither the cum in the hotel room, you know, or
none of it was enough. Not weird enough for you.
You know, it all felt like on the surface like very hee hee ha ha funny, you know, but it like didn't like sting, or like mean anything to me greater than that. Like, for example, again, the many lyrics on the new Wednesday record, which sometimes can be very like, heartbreaking. And, I'm all down. I'm very much down, especially in like hip hop music, for like, a weird kind of tongue in cheek cultural reference, but, I ask when that stuff comes up, like, what are you evoking here? And like, why, and it just didn't really sort of seem to be, at least for me, like leading much of anywhere in a lot of instances. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, yeah, it's like personal preference. That's fair. How are you going about listening to albums? Like, since you're against like sort of like the passive listening, like, do you like to like go on a walk while you're listening to new albums? Like, what's your process like?
Sometimes I will sort of like be walking or do something like that, just because I've found that I'm a little ADHD and kind of fidgety sometimes. So, having myself doing kind of like super low grade physical movement keeps me a little more locked in, and keeps me able to kind of like focus and concentrate a little bit more. Typically, I'm really just like kind of just putting it on, and I'm in my house or my listening room or whatever, and I'm just like sort of researching and writing notes at the same time, and just sort of like writing immediate reactions and thoughts that I'm having to certain chord changes or instrumental palettes or things that are being said, and what the production sounds like overall, what the album sounds like, with respect to maybe past projects where it sort of seems like things are headed, or what the album or track list or body of work is saying like as a whole.
Are you also relying on other critics to find music too?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The thing is, I feel like the only reason I can effectively be a generalist in the way that I am is because there are people that very much like kind of specialize and sort of like obsess over very sort of like niche music styles and underground stuff and artists like that. And, it's only through sort of like their knowledge and appreciation of sort of like in these more obscure spaces, what makes certain records or sounds stand out, that I'm then able to sort of like, see what's maybe rising to the top in those spaces and be like, oh, this is actually so good. I sort of like see merit in it outside of the context of it just kind of like working in this scene. Like, for example, one of my favorite kind of like underground projects that came out last year that, when I reviewed it and I talked about it, this person like sold out of all of their tapes on Bandcamp, which I was very happy to hear about, was this sort of like a Polish tape music producer that goes by the name Miffle. And she just comes together with all of these like really crazy acoustic wintry tape experiments, just like kind of recording these violin and guitar passages and then taking those and sort of like melting them and warping them with all of these different weird little tape experiments and distortions and effects, and kind of just come together with these strange drones and walls of sound. And if it wasn't for people who are like, like really deep in the ambient music trenches that were kind of like, really hype and celebrating that record and saying great things about it when I sort of ran across it, because I was not the first person to listen to that album, then, I wouldn't have stumbled across it and been excited to hear it and put it as high as I did on my year-end list. I mean, there are some things that I stumble across, or maybe not even so much stumble across, but I find myself talking about way before anybody else. But these days, because of like the way that the platform has grown and there's so many different artists of different stripes who are watching and listening to a lot of things that I say, when that is the case, more often than not is because like maybe I've been given an email, and I do try to, on a somewhat regular basis, like go through the things people are throwing my way and recommending me, and sort of like seeing what's up through that. And that's the way that I came across artists like Backwash, for example, who since covering her stuff, she's gotten music awards and has become a favorite rapper and artist among a lot of different people. I'm not like an island. I'm not like somebody who's just like singularly finding out about all of this cool stuff completely on my own. It's like often I am sort of like checking out artists and records that I end up enjoying because I see other people excited about them and I see other people talking about them.
What's your like go-to? Like,
I wouldn't say it's one single place, but either people are like sending me things on social media, or I'm very aware of what certain record labels are coming out with in the underground because I've been following them for years. Sometimes there's a new great experimental metal record coming out through 20 buck spin. Sometimes there's a new crazy exciting electronic music record that's coming out through, you know, a legendary label like Warp, for example. You know, it's like I've been listening to albums on these platforms for a long time, so I'm usually aware of like when they're dropping or doing something new. In addition to that, like you know, I'm reading maybe what certain websites are posting that have like maybe a bit more of a niche focus on certain genres, be it like either a resident advisor or like a hip hop DX. I mean, there's also a lot of sort of like TikTok curators and the like who I follow, like my friend Kelsey, who was, I think she was once known as the Yellow Button, who was also giving me a lot of guff over the MJ Lenderman as well. So shout out to her for doing that. She's punished me a bit over that record too. But you know, she's like way tuned into a lot of indie records and emo records in a way that, you know, I'm not on an everyday basis in the way that, you know, she is. I would also shout out like places like Album of the Year, Rate Your Music, you know, certain like music review aggregators where like a lot of fans are kind of like, you know, giving their opinion on a bunch of different albums. And while I do think kind of like the process of you know, just averaging out people's review user scores and deciding what's good and what's not isn't always the best and most fruitful process, like those are still interesting places to go to sort of like see what's doing well and what's like, you know, resonating with people within certain lanes of music and certain styles and certain genres. In addition to all of that, there's like PR people too who are emailing me and reaching out to me on a regular basis and putting me onto certain things, you know, based upon like maybe what they've seen me review in the past. And, you know, they'll come through and just be like, hey, I think you'll like this. You know, that's how I've heard about groups like Snow Strippers and stuff like that, you know, and have been put on, you know, to artists such as Prostitute as well, who are doing like really well lately. They just signed to a label after a, you know, a really great like kind of underground noise rock record from them kind of popped off.
Do you see yourself still going to shows regularly now?
Yeah, no, I mean, as regularly as I can. I mean, you know, with respect to kind of like my work schedule being busy and just like personal stuff that makes it difficult to sort of like, you know, go to concerts all the time. But yeah. Do
you feel kind of like watched in those spaces? Like, do you enjoy the
Oh yeah, most definitely. Yeah. And, you know, I mean, it's like, it's just something that like, I don't know, I've come to expect, and it is what it is. It's funny, I don't know if like a lot of people know this, but like most artists have like a term for that I didn't know about, because obviously I'm not in a touring band or whatever, but like most bands call it getting punished. And you know, it's just like basically you're an artist, you're at a show, you've played like a good set, and if you are in the crowd somewhere, you know, there's like those 3 or 4 people that will like literally talk your ear off for an hour, you know, about like the set you just played or the new record you just came out with or whatever. And, you know, sometimes like when I'm in these spaces and I'm going to see a band that I've talked about, and, you know, they'll catch me sort of like having these conversations and be like, oh man, you're getting punished more than us today, you know, or something, or like, do you need us to do anything to help you from getting punished? It's like, I don't know where this terminology came from. But it's like, I haven't heard anybody like talk about it. It's just funny to kind of like hear it personally, because that's not, you know, it's probably a lot less stressful to me though, because I'm not at work, you know, whereas like they're literally at work, they're doing their job, you know, they've just like put in all this effort to do a show. They're probably worried and stressed about sort of like, I don't know, the ticket sales at the door and how much money they're gonna like leave with before they go to the next show. So, you know, they may not always have like the energy to like have a full length conversation with somebody about like, you know, the show that they just played. But, you know, for the most part, like when I enter these spaces, yeah, I'm very quickly and very easily recognized. And again, it's just something that I've come to expect. And the interactions always go down pleasantly, so long as like I just kind of keep it very simple and chill and just respectful and say thank you and just kind of hear people out. What made you like want to put your sort of like face and voice out there? What was the jump between like just being a listener and like wanting to be a critic? I think like sort of participating in some of those like, you know, online music spaces that we were talking about earlier in the local scene or on like LiveJournal, because I was like seeing some friends of mine who were like, you know, using those places, which I mean, often people would just typically just talk about their day. Knowing that they had like a bunch of their friends following, they would also like, you know, take time out in their week to sort of just recommend music that they were listening to, or talk about maybe why a certain record they're hearing is great. And I started doing that myself too. And I feel like it also comes from like the spirit of wanting to share music, just by virtue of being a part of my college radio station at the time when I was going to SCSU. You know, I loved sort of like, you know, not just like doing a music show and kind of putting together the idea of like, you know, curating a set list for a show and so on and so forth, but like also what everybody else was into musically there. It was cool to be able to get in touch with people who are just like really passionate about indie music and really passionate about hip hop and really passionate about electronic music and metal and so on and so forth, and sort of like hear what they were playing on their shows and what they sort of like knew and what they heard about with the different specialties that they were into, you know. Mm-hmm. This whole thing originally started as a podcast of, you know, thinking of what I was doing as something that could be turned into a show or a program or a piece of content that could like expose other people to music that I was into or that I thought was worth their time, that wasn't getting shine anywhere else.
Do you feel like you were a good radio station director?
I don't know if I was the best. It was not an easy job. Like I enjoyed, I was doing the music director position for a year, and then I moved up to general manager from there. And it was definitely like the first year especially was like hard because the radio station was not always, and still to this day is like, has not always been like a super huge priority of the administration at the school. And in addition to that, like the school had, and this is like so niche, myopic, you know, this is but still it's lore.
I did UConn's radio station, so I like am curious.
Well, the school had switched student centers that year.
Okay.
And they did not come up with a plan for how the radio station was going to transition from one building to the next. So there was like a huge drop in like morale with just like the feeling among, you know, the DJs and the people involved in the station that like, oh, we've been like abandoned here. Why didn't they want to move us over? Why didn't they want to prioritize us? Why don't they care about like, you know, every other club got moved over and prioritized and so on and so forth. But like, why didn't they care about making sure the radio station moved over in time? So we were like stuck in that old building for like more than a year, if I remember correctly, before we finally made the transition over. I mean, I do think going into the future, there is like potential in college radio stations, like finding new platforms or ways of kind of like presenting the medium, because there's such a demand out there for like live streaming now, you know, especially on like Twitch and places like that, and people doing all sorts of like live DJ type music shows, either there or on TikTok. Like those are spaces in which college stations can most definitely step in, you know, and start like making a name for themselves. Like once again, it might be a little difficult with like, you know, getting permissions from the school to sort of like, you know, represent something that is obviously so directly connected to the school in that way and have it on such a potentially large platform. But like, you know, personally, from my own perspective, I do see like a little bit of like a lack of enthusiasm among, you know, students and potential sort of like members of these clubs, thinking like, why would I even be on the college station? Like, what's the point? Who would hear me? But, you know, I think stations have like, you know, an opportunity to sort of like create an experience where these kids who maybe want to sort of like experiment with like creating programming and being a host and doing shows and deep diving on certain things and creating content that's around their passion, be it a radio show, be it a podcast, whatever. Just making something that makes more sense for the internet instead of sort of like presenting it like this weird old media thing that maybe a lot of students don't necessarily directly identify with because they don't use it themselves.
Yeah, but even like outside of like college radio, do you think like Spotify and like these sort of social media platforms that we're relying on now, do you think they're going to not be the place where people go to discover music anymore? Or?
Yeah, no, for sure. Like there's been a replacement happening with Spotify to radio in general, like not even college radio. But like, you know, I think that doesn't mean that like the battle's over, you know what I mean? Like there are still college radio stations and there are still community radio stations. WPKN still exists over here, you know? Like these spaces are still around, and we still can use them and support them, and we should be doing that. Now is as good a time as ever to try to pull something off or make an effort to make these platforms make sense in the internet age, because there is like kind of a, growing sentiment of streaming fatigue around any and all kinds of content, be it visual, be it, music. And, when you look at, music sales across the board, I mean, even again, with the economy being as terrible as it is, vinyl sales went up again over the past year. If everybody's music listening experience through platforms like Spotify was completely hunky-dory and giving them everything that they wanted, like there still wouldn't be this demand for physical media, So it's like giving people, helping to get the word out for alternative sort of platforms for streaming and for sort of like, the bland everyday slop you get handed when you're just kind of like perusing around the Spotify front page. Because I mean, honestly, that's how most people use streaming these days. They just sort of like try to operate it in the same way that maybe someone did a radio station back in the day. They're just looking for something to play in the background. And it's just that, because of metrics and because of numbers, like all these platforms are doing is just sort of like engineering new ways to sort of like make these playlists and make this program and make these recommendations as just sort of predictable as possible, so that it doesn't sort of make anybody sort of consider changing the channel or skipping the track or moving on to something else, which like that has nothing to do with sort of like actively listening to music. That's just tricking people into letting something play in the background so that you can generate as much money as possible.
Do you have anything else you want to add about sort of Connecticut music, etc., just in general?
I think the problem with kids today is one of the coolest, newest, sickest bands that are out right now, and more people need to pay attention to them. I'll say that.
Also, I just needed to ask, how did you feel after the Adam Friedland interview?
No, it was fine. I mean, I don't know if this sort of like came across like in the interview itself, but like, because obviously like he was very combative and he wanted it to be as like, tense and as entertaining as possible. But like, as soon as it was over, he's like, man, I love you. What you do is so amazing. He had me like sitting in a chair so that he could show me like old Rolling Stones performances. Like, this is my favorite one. And, he's like, this is them on Ed Sullivan. He had to change the lyrics. He's like just completely nerding out, like as combative as he was being, like a lot of what he was saying and doing there comes from like spending a long time watching what I do, what I mean? And as long as like, even if you don't agree with a lot of what I say, if like what I'm doing is inspiring some kind of like reaction in people, even if it's like causing them to sort of further defend or dig their heels into what they like and think more about what it is that appeals to them about it. I mean, there's a lot of people that watch my reviews and say like, yeah, I agree with everything that you said, but that's why I like it, like, that's all that matters to me at the end of the day. It's not about sort of like landing on the same page and having the same opinion at the end of the day. It's having your own reasons to be passionate about what you like and what you care about.
Thanks so much for watching this interview with Anthony Fantano. If you want to see more from this interview and check out other great Connecticut content, be sure to read the new issue of Connecticunt by going to connecticunt.xyz/subscribe. Thanks so much for watching.